New Forest. Until recently, I was working with Mary very closely as part of the Curlew Recovery Partnership, where I was the manager. Mary's carrying on as the chair. But in the day job here in the New Forest, I'm director of a conservation organisation called Wild New Forest. Tonight we're going to be talking about conservation in the round. So it's not specifically about curlews, but the topic is one that we wrangle with quite a lot at Curlew Action and working in Curlew Action, and it is, are we fighting hard enough for nature? The trite answer would be no, in which case we could end early and all go down to the virtual pub and have a beer. But luckily we've got three excellent panelists to talk us through this particular conundrum. So introducing Roisin Taylor, co-director of UK Youth for Nature, Richard Benwell, who's chief executive of Wildlife and Countryside Link, and Derek Gow, reintroduction expert and farmer turned conservationist. So I'm going to ask our panelists to give themselves a brief introduction in a minute, but just to say a few words about this. I mean, why is Curlew Action hosting this particular webinar? One of the things we often talk about is the fact that curlews sit at the nexus of many of the key conservation issues of our age, whether it's farming and agri-environment policy, forestry, predator management, human recreational impacts, urban creep, coastal squeeze. All of these things impact curlews. And as a consequence, by its very nature, curlew conservation is very collaborative, and the Curlew Recovery Partnership and certainly in Curlew Action, we take that collaborative approach where we work with people working on the land, farmers, gamekeepers, big landowners, big conservation NGOs, and the various relevant parts of government, or irrelevant depending on your view. But sometimes we think, well, is that the right way? Is a collaborative approach right? And actually, should we be more combative? But if we're going to be more combative, who are we going to be fighting? And if we're going to be fighting people, who are we going to be upsetting, and will that have an impact? So all of those things are the kinds of issues that we wrangle with in curlew conservation, but they're familiar across the whole conservation spectrum. I'm just going to give two case studies of what I'd call sort of bottom-up fighting for nature and more of a sort of top-down fighting for nature approach. The bottom-up one will be familiar to many of you, and that's the whole issue of combined sewer overflows, or in short, sewage dumping in our rivers and seas by a whole host of commercial outfits, and it's a regulatory failure in its most extreme form. But that really has come to the fore politically, and now is a focus for action both by the regulators and by the companies themselves, because basically lots of small fires sprung up around the country by individuals and individual groups who really just got pissed off with what was going on in their local area. And those collectively, particularly during the sort of COVID period and the year or two subsequent to that, have made it into the national agenda. So there wasn't really any top-down steer from the big conservation NGOs around this topic, or from government. This was really small local groups. I was involved here in the New Forest, where on an August day during lockdown, on a lockdown walk with my then 2-year-old, we couldn't cross the Beaulieu River in the New Forest National Park, one of the jewels in the crown for nature conservation, because it had rained heavily the night before, and they were flushing a combined sewer overflow discharge into it, and you could smell the river before you could see it. And I got really angry about this and started raising awareness in my local community, and started thinking, well, why the hell am I doing this when there's Natural England, the National Park Authority, Environment Agency, all these bodies paid to do this? But this is what happened. It was very bottom up, very organic, and we are where we are now, which is in hopefully a much better place, and action is starting to be taken. The other example, I guess, is an interesting one in the context of this webinar title. About probably 6 to 8 months ago now, in the rather short-lived and ill-fated Truss administration, we had the sort of remarkable sort of press release that came out from three of the big NGOs, primarily RSPB Wildlife Trust, National Trust, really throwing their weight around by the fact that combined they've got 10 million members, a big proportion, 15% or so of the electorate, and for the first time in history they said, we're angry. Well, if you work in conservation like I do, you're angry most of the time. So it's quite remarkable that it needed this what was called an attack on nature to get them to come out and say we're angry and our members are angry. but it did have an impact, and policy side really took notice of it. So that was more around the big organisations sort of clubbing together and that sort of 10 million membership and really making it work. But it's interesting that equally, this very bottom-up organic movement of people has started to get some real traction around the sewage disposal issue. So we can fight in different ways, and I guess for me it'd be interesting tonight to think about, as well as fighting hard, how can we fight smart for nature? Because I think that's going to be really key going forwards. So there's a few words from me. Ellen's done some of the basic housekeeping, so everyone's muted, which is great. It's all nice and quiet, good sound quality. If you're not familiar with the chat, it's in the little set of buttons and symbols. There's a chat symbol, and if you click on that, you can type in questions. Feel free to type in as we go along, in case there's something that you might forget later on, and we'll try and address those later in the webinar. If you hear a fire alarm, run for your lives. And we're going to be going for about 90 minutes. So if you need the toilet, feel free, but please make sure your camera's switched off when you're doing so. Without further ado, I'm going to start with Roisin. So if you can just spend a few minutes telling us about your role and how you're fighting for nature in that role, that would be fantastic.
I can indeed, and hopefully this is the point at which my Wi-Fi holds out, because it's not been great all day. Ellen, please may you share your screen, because you've got a few slides. I realise I'm the sort of relatively unknown figure out of this lineup, so I thought I'd give you a bit of a visual representation of who I am, what I'm doing, and what I'm doing to fight for nature. So my name is Roisin Taylor. I run a flower farming business called Verde Flower Co. up in County Durham in the northeast of England. I'm also co-director for UK Youth for Nature, and I'm also an off-field farming scholar, so I'm going to give you a bit of an insight into that. Next slide, please. So my background is in hen harrier conservation, working in the uplands, working on a farm. So I grew up in County Durham, basically surrounded by the uplands, but having a connection with nature, but not necessarily putting my finger on that connection to nature. I went down south to do my undergraduate degree in human, social and political sciences, had a bit of a mental breakdown and went home to work on a farm. And I learned to dry stone wool, and I really picked up that connection to nature again, and I absolutely loved it. I went to do my second degree in University of St Andrews, and once that was complete, I realised I'd spent a hell of a lot of time basically trying to focus on farming, and kind of started asking myself questions about what that meant. So I came back to the northeast of England, didn't want to go to London, and I started working for the RSPB. And I ended up working there for about 4 years. But the real education for me was my first job, which was as a community engagement officer for the Hen Harrier Life Project, which, as you can all imagine, I'm sure you're all seasoned veterans in this, was really a very strong introduction to human-wildlife conflict. And also, importantly, was sort of centred around the place that I grew up, the people I spent my time with as a young person. And so it was really central to sort of I would say formal education was this work in the Hen Harrier Project. So did a lot of that kind of work, but ultimately realised after 4 years at the RSPB working on hen harriers, conservation, illegal persecution, and then climate change policy that I wanted to be a flower farmer. So next slide, please. And the reason for this is I got furloughed and I realised that actually the thing that I was missing was the on-the-ground work. I absolutely love growing. Didn't know I loved growing, but I do. It just feels like a central core to what I do. And so now I run on my own Verde Flower Co., which is a pesticide, herbicide, and fungicide-free flower farm. But really, I guess what I'm looking at now is, so I've left the current flower farm, which was about 2 acres. We're looking to expand to about 10 acres through investment. But I'm really hoping to build a business that is adapting to a 2-degree warming world. It's something that we don't really talk about when we talk about climate and nature crisis, is that kind of opportunity and adaptation space. And a large part of the kind of core centre of the business is around making space for nature. That really runs kind of throughout the whole piece. So that includes things like cover cropping, low impact tool use, soil restoration, making sure everything we do is pollinator friendly, and that there's a massive crop diversity. We grow about 220 different species of flowers up there. Next slide, please. And then the other side of this is my UK Youth for Nature work. So for those who don't know, UK Youth for Nature is the leading UK youth movement calling on the government to take urgent action on the nature crisis. I'm very fortunate to work alongside Ellen, who is running these slides, as the co-directors. And there's some photos here from our recent action, which was a chemical cocktail bar reception with Wildlife and Countryside Link down in London with MPs and lords and lots of members of civil society, all about the hideous chemicals that are currently flowing through our waterways. And that links to our two core campaigns this year. So we're looking at Not So Freshwater, which is a focus on agricultural chemicals in our freshwater ecosystems, and also the Urban Nature campaign. So that's all about access to nature, increasing diversity and access to nature from communities who might not be able to access nature right now, but also thinking about the kind of quality of that nature that they're able to access. But really, the kind of central thing that we do at UK Youth for Nature is it's about giving young people opportunities to affect change. So kind of going beyond just youth engagement and really thinking about training and skill sharing so that they can be the kind of campaigners for the future. And finally, Ellen. And that takes me to the kind of third wing, I guess, which is my Nuffield Farming Scholarship this year. So I'm looking at basically, is the British cut flower industry prepared for 2-degree warming world? That includes lots of travel. So I'll be traveling around the UK, to the Netherlands, Kenya, New Zealand to understand best practice in the climate adaptation space. But it's not just thinking about kind of what environmental adaptation we need to be delivering in agriculture and horticulture, but also thinking about community adaptation. So what skill sharing do we need to do? What kind of knowledge exchange is there already existing? What kind of existing frameworks can we replicate over here in the UK to prepare ourselves better? And including, there'll be a podcast called Flowers for the Future, which I'm currently working on at the moment, interviewing lots of leaders in this space. But I think hopefully you'll take away from the 3 pieces of my life at the moment that nature is a really big driver for me and throughout all of my work. And I'm really interested in that intersection between where agriculture and horticulture can provide opportunities for big nature payoffs in our not just adaptation plans, but in our businesses and livelihoods anyway. So that's a quick overview of who I am, what I'm doing, and where my focus on nature lies.
Thanks, Roisin. That's perfect. Can I ask Richard to again provide an introduction and say a little bit about how you're fighting for nature in your role?
Thanks so much, Russ. So hello, folks. I'm Richard from Wildlife and Countryside Link. From those of you who haven't heard of us, we're a coalition of 76 nature charities, and our fight is all about law and policy. So you'd be forgiven for not having heard of us. We don't have a public face. All of our energy is focused on Westminster and trying to get the politicians to stop doing rubbish stuff and start doing better stuff. Our work spans animal welfare, human health and environmental well-being, and of course biodiversity, nature crisis and climate change. And I guess we're all about the fight. If you ask us, are we fighting hard enough? If you ask anybody in the environment sector, are we fighting hard enough? Have you ever met anybody in the environment sector who's gone, oh, it's an easy day today, I'm just having a cup of tea? Everybody is frantically busy all the time, working tremendously hard. So I guess our aim is to try and make sure that we're focusing that energy in the right place to win the fights that matter, and make sure that we're speaking as a united voice that can make things work well. In terms of my reflections on the sector and how well we do that, well, we're brilliant at fighting off stuff, aren't we? When do we see the nature voices rise up in righteous fury? It's when there's something bad proposed, and that sort of fortress conservation heritage that we've all come from, where we want to stop that unsustainable development, where we want to make that polluter get off the case. Those are the moments when we fight really, really well. When we fight less well is when we're fighting for stuff, when we're asking for change, when we're looking for those big system improvements that are needed, not just to stop one corner of our natural environment from being harmed, but actually to transform the country as a whole into a better place for nature. So those fights for things are where we devote our energies and trying to be propositional about the good stuff. As you might imagine, we also spend quite a lot of time trying to stop the wrong fights from happening. That's the other thing that you can say about the conservation world. We haven't always been as unanimous as we might be, have we? And some of the saddest moments in my time in this sector have been the sort of green on green spats where somebody with an access priority might not agree with somebody with a core conservation priority, or where climate butts up against nature. Those are the fights that we work hard to resolve, and to do so in a way that doesn't just lead to a woolly nothingness, but actually leads to stronger and very specific policy proposals. And one final comment, if I may, Russ, when it comes to the fights, there are also fights that we want to happen that currently aren't. So I guess part of my business is trying to get the politicians to fight a bit more and to get that huge political energy that's out there fighting to be the best for nature. When we get to this point in the political cycle, we always see this sort of sum of the nature fight defaulting to something banal, like how many trees more can I plant than you? 42,000 versus 45,000. That's not the fight we want to see. We want to see those politicians standing up at the run up to the general election, not just saying we'll be nice to nature, but actually fighting for the specific policy proposals that are going to make that big difference. And the fight we want to see is a race to the top on political ambition for nature. And I guess that's basically what Link does.
Great, thanks, Richard. Polished as always, and I like the green on green phrase. I shall take that one away. Right, last but not least, Derek, you know the drill now, so over to you. You're still on mute at the minute.
I'm Derek Gow. Can you hear me? I think you can. I've worked in nature conservation for a quarter of a century. I've travelled to see projects all over the world. I've spoken to many people who are inspiring, and it's an interesting time. I was brought up in the borders of Scotland, and when I was little, curlews were a common bird. The sound of the curlew was the sound of the air, and they were everywhere. And who would have thought that in less than a lifetime, we'd be taking these birds from the east of England, their eggs from the east of England, where they're going to be destroyed in chaos on the Air Force bases, bringing them into incubators and turning out their progeny into landscapes from which the bird had gone. This, I'm afraid, is the future for many species. If you speak to my colleagues who are working now in the WWT on willow tits, if you speak to the guys from Natural England and the RSPB who are looking at what's left of the twites, a tiny bird, the smaller than a canary, which has run out of habitat and space and time in England and will not survive for very many more years. They're doomed and extinct, and one day the headline about them will follow the headline there was last year in The Guardian about the sound of silence when it came to ring ouzels on Dartmoor, and that was the end of them. We live in a time when great things have happened. When you've seen Roy Dennis and his colleagues move the white-tailed eagles from Scotland, from which they were moved to from Norway, again, half a lifetime ago, down to the Isle of Wight to nest again, hopefully one day, on the Undercliff, as they last did in the 1860s. We've seen remarkable people, fight against a system of bureaucracy that's so imbecilically stupid. It was designed to fail, to restore the great bustard to Salisbury Plain, to the point where you can go out to one of their hides and see hundreds of males lurking at the right time of year. People who love change the future of species and change the future of nature. Now, it's no disrespect to Richard or anybody who tries to influence the political scene. But with all due respect, and he's more sophisticated than I am because he's hiding his drink underneath his tie, whereas I'm making no pretensions to drinking it from a bottle. That's what makes the difference. If people love, things change. If people don't love, Governments don't save creatures. I've watched goalpost after goalpost move. I've watched BAP targets set, stand and fall simply because they could never be attained in the first place. My background is farming and then zoos. When I was involved, when I was a little boy, I read Gerald Durrell's books, and they inspired me, to think about all these wondrous creatures, pig pigeons, Mauritius kestrels, all these dwindling animals and birds from all over the world that he and his remarkable team were saving from extinction. In 1990, I went to the summer school in Jersey, and I met some of these guys, and you looked at what they were doing with things like the ecological rebuilding of atolls in the Pacific, which have been completely destroyed by introduced sheep and goats and by overhunting from the old sailing ships of the giant tortoise that governed the plants. And you look at this and think, what pertinence could this possibly have to Britain? And the longer I've spent working with species in this country, the more I've begun to believe that it's completely pertinent. That by the time we reach 133rd in the world rankings of most impoverished, nature-impoverished countries, or wherever we've got to in the dregs in the bottom of the barrel now, what we're looking at is we're looking at rebuilding from nothing. Despite the wondrous things, despite the conversations there are now about restoring wildcats, despite the triumph that the pine marten has been, despite the amazing whirling of the red kites over many of the motorways that we traverse as we go through the journeys that make up our normal lives, the biomass of this island has crashed. And when you look at it, the headline in The Guardian 2 weeks ago, which is saying that over 550 million birds have disappeared from the skies of Europe in the last quarter century, I defy anybody to say that we're winning. Some minds are changing. But when you come to your 10 million figure that was argued by the nature kill conservation bodies in the terrible times of Truss, Mark Avery presents a different perspective of that in his book that will be out in 2 weeks' time. And for those of you who've seen the preview of it, he's saying that many of these, this is an uncountable figure, that many of these people have multiple memberships of organisations, and that it's probably not 10 million at all, and it might even be closer to 250,000. So the biggest challenge we face as a species on this planet is disconnection from all that's real. It's disconnection from the fact that you can't catch a micromoth anymore in Cambridge, that the swifts have gone, that you're seeing a planet without argument just dying around us. So I think we need to be desperately concerned about this. I believe in consensus. I have met so many decent people who work in farming and decent people who work in the gamekeeping community. But I will say this, you can have consensus and reasonable conversations with people who are reasonable. And for the other people whose hearts as dark as they were ever in the Middle Ages, you can have nothing other than opposition. I've worked with the beavers. I've worked with beavers for, again, quarter of a century. You look at how they're being treated in Scotland. You look at how little progress we've officially made. Politicians shuffling paper, organisations saying they will do, when in reality the only thing that's moved forward, the return of this life-giving creature to the landscape where it should be, is people acting often against the law. In the end, I certainly will not censure their actions because they've been remarkable people. They've shown bravery and commitment and courage. And on the back of what they've done, they probably restored this remarkable wetland engineer, which is the bringer of life to landscapes that are desolate, to the extent where maybe 3,000 may now be swimming in our rivers and our creeks and our pools. So it's a difficult time. It's a time when we do need to engage with people. We need to think about things that government and statute and conventional nature conservation organisations just don't take account for. If you look at the White Stork project at NEP, which was opposed quite roundly by organisations like the Sussex Wildlife Trust and many others, that whole project always was about hope. It was about bringing back a bird that's always been associated with regeneration, rebirth, recovery. And I was with Charlie and Izzy in the field when the first chick that was hatched at NEP took off from the nest, flew down to the ground. There were hundreds of people there with us. Some of them were crying on their knees. And in the days that followed, as it was announced in the media, Izzy had tens of thousands of people writing by to say it gave them such hope. So we need hope. We need to look at what can be done in this lifetime, and we need to act upon it with a spirit of urgency that we very seldom show. And that's the great challenge that's facing us when it comes to regeneration of nature.
Thank you, Derek. One of the key words I had in my notes was optimism. And it can be pretty bloody difficult to remain optimistic in the face of some of the kinds of figures that Derek's reminded us of. But I would concur that there's a role for flagship species. Beaver's one of those. You mentioned pine marten down here in the New Forest. It's had a real massive impact on the community. The fact that people can go out and see white-tailed eagles, goshawks are now well established. We've got pine martens in the woods, and although people don't see them, it gives people the sense that this is a slightly wilder place as a consequence. It's not just an urban park. And even species like otter and common and grey seal have quietly sort of made comebacks, but many of those have done so not as part of any kind of official reintroduction. So I would concur with that. I guess following on from many of the comments that we've heard in the last 15 minutes as part of those intros, the first question I would pose to the panel is, should we be becoming angrier? The title of this webinar is, are we fighting hard enough? So should we be becoming angrier when we're communicating with policymakers and or the public, or would that be counterproductive? And I'm going to kick off with Richard on that one.
Sometimes, definitely. You need to fight on all the fronts in all the ways. There are times when we've been far too bashful in calling out outrageously bad decisions. And in those moments, we definitely need to show emotion. But we need to show the panoply of emotions, don't we? We've already heard about love. And sometimes it's just as powerful to have people saying, do this because we love it. Do this because we want it. Do this because we're sad at what we've lost. So anger has to be part of an armory of emotions to get what we want. And just we're in this moment, aren't we, where we know we're at a precipice. The sort of statistical version of the curlew story that Derek told is that our priority species index down from start of the record 100 in 1970 down to just 17% now, and the story is the same across the board. 40,000 premature deaths from air pollution a year, none of our rivers in good condition. It's a really sad picture, but I do think that we can turn it round, and part of that will be with the brave actions of some angry folk going out and pioneering reintroductions. Part of it will be getting XR and everybody out there with banners, flying and waving the flags and making sure that people know that we care. And part of it will be about making sure that we have the forceful conversations with politicians to ensure that the system changes there, so that when we do the reintroductions, we don't just see things dying out again because the pollution hasn't abated, the habitat loss hasn't abated, and the businesses can go on polluting with impunity anymore. We have to fight on all the fronts. Sometimes that will be with rage, sometimes it will be with love.
Great. I'll come to Roshi next. So one of the things that cheered me up most in recent years was when all the kids started striking at school, the climate strikes, which unfortunately then got sort of pended by COVID and have struggled to regain momentum. But there's a real feeling pre-COVID that the younger generation were getting pretty angry about the lack of action within the sort of statutory bodies, politics, etc., around climate and the nature emergency. Where do you stand at the moment with UK Youth for Nature? Do you think you're angry enough, or do you think that would be counterproductive? How do you tackle this?
Yeah, great question that we tackle quite frequently. Ellen and I and the board as well talk about this a lot. So that was the moment actually for me. That was the catalyzing moment when I thought, oh my goodness, okay, I've got to move my activism beyond the policy space and the work that I'm doing, at the RSPB. It has to go to a point at which I am risking something for myself. That was the point that I realized through those climate strikes. But I would say I was also hugely encouraged to do so, because the senior leadership at the RSPB said, everyone take the day off, everyone in the organisation go and support the young people striking. And so as an office, we all went out. And that was the moment when I thought, okay, I've really got to start putting myself on the line, because, you know, this is something that I feel really passionate about. It's something we come back to time and time again at UK Youth for Nature, because we do play a more middle ground. And I agree with pretty much everything Derek has said about anger and love and inspiring people through nature and a need for absolute urgency. But there is also an interesting turn-off point for a lot of young people that we come up against time and time again in our interviews when we're getting new volunteers. They say, I can't do what XR are doing. I can't glue myself to XYZ. It's just not the place I can be in. You know, I can't put myself under that risk. And so we hope that we provide a place where you can do that if you want to. If we want to go out and organise that, then we can provide that. But equally, we can allow people to use the skill sets that they have, and a lot of those are creative skill sets, to campaign in a slightly different way. Because I think that in order to make change, it has to be a universal voice. That's the number one thing. We have to all be able to say the same, not necessarily the same thing, but we all have to say something loudly together. But everybody has a different skill set. Everyone has something different that they want to bring to the party. And so we're just another cog in that kind of wheel, I guess. But it doesn't mean in my personal life, I'm not out there on the streets, because equally that is important to me as well. Great,
thank you. I'm not going to ask Derek if you need to get angrier, but what I'm going to say is, can you, from your perspective, can you give examples of where you think in UK conservation there are things that are working well, in your view? Obviously, there's a lot of things that aren't, but from your perspective, obviously, you know, the way you're working with species reintroductions, you're sort of ploughing a very specific furrow. What other areas do you see around UK conservation that give you cause for optimism in terms of the delivery model? Because there's lots of different ways we can do it, and I'm full of admiration of the way that you're delivering your component of it. What other parts of the UK conservation scene at the minute do you think, actually, I get that, that's working pretty well at the minute? Oh, you're muted again, sorry. Oh, I've still got no sound, Derek.
Right, is that better? Okay.
You're on now, yeah.
Right, if there's one area that gives me ground for hope, it's rewilding. It's the conversation, though it's been, the attempt has been made to turn the whole thing into a toxic term by those who oppose it. It's, in essence, taking land back from unproductive agriculture and restoring the landscape for nature. And I don't particularly care about how it happens, whether it's a cultivated middle course where we take the fields that are full of artificial richness and we rip it out by deep ploughing or taking off the silage or, and we restore the yellow rattle, and then we restore the old plants. It doesn't matter to me whether we look at this or we look at a net model where you enclose large areas of the landscape and you put big herbivores in and you present an argument for boar living free and beavers living free, and then you start to talk one day about the predators that we will definitely need if we want to create a landscape where the trees we need to grow to slow the impact of climate change are going to survive, because we're not coming to terms with the deer. So I think rewilding offers great hope. I think many of the people like the great estates, you know, people like Lord Lowther and Lord Cholmondeley and others are beginning to act in a way that is truly inspirational. They are not conventional thinkers. They don't sit in committees. They don't know what the IUCN guidelines are. What they see is a planet that's ailing, and they see their ability to help. So I think there is hope, but I think it's going to come, real fast progress is going to come from the most unexpected direction. It's going to come from people like Charlie Burrell, who talked a dream 20 years ago and now has delivered a site which is truly wondrous and is without compare. That man and his wife Isabella Tree have set a standard that the others who wish to do this really have to follow. And his arguments that this poor farmland should never have been used for with subsidies and never productive without chemicals. And we now know that the chemicals and the pesticides in their own right are untenable. That man has shown us how we can redevelop a landscape. So this bucolic image you have of England or Scotland with its hedges or its grouse moors or whatever else, well, that needs to change. And that's going to be a painful process where vested interests, as we well know, are going to clash time and again over what should happen. And if you look at the curlew as a symbol, there you have a cracking example of people that will tell you they're managing landscapes for the curlews, and it's a great discussion. But what they won't talk to you about is the persecution of the birds of prey and the other raptorial species, and the fact that a twy, which is something that's the size of a small canary, can no longer survive in environments that are so forbiddingly barren that they can't find nesting space. So there is hope. There are people who are going to do and are doing incredible things, but there are significant impediments in their way, and one of these is the fact that we have no culture of nature conservation in this country that is truly productive. When we talk nature, it's been an old naturalist way of doing, whereby we can see a beauty in a springtail and a test tube jumping around, on a table while naturalists look at it, but we can't see the ruins anymore that these creatures exist in. So I'm not going to give you some homespun yarn here about great hope and great opportunity. The truth is that. But if there is hope, it's in changing land use practice. And what I will say, just as a final thought on rewilding, is that when you look at all the jumping up and down about room for nature, and we can't. And bear in mind that 23 million subsidised acres of the British Isles are farmed, maybe 50,000. But if you ask the optimist Alistair Driver, who's director for Rewilding Britain, that's in charge of it, are heading towards a rewilding future. Michael Gove was right. If we're spending public money, that public money to landowners should be spent on public goods. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this campaign against nature that's been raised now principally by the National Farmers Union is just that. It's an attempt to take more of your taxpayers' money forever for doing nothing. And if you listen that we are about to starve and you believe their persuasive arguments, then why are we growing all this barley to make into beer? What about the golf courses? What about the pony paddocks? What about the daffodils? What about the solar? What about the biofuels? What about all these what about 2.5% of the corn we grow going into feeding pheasants, which are then obliterated as flying targets and burned? These are major land use issues. So if we're going to starve, these are the things we need to focus on first. And you hear not a word in opposition to them, because of course, these are many of their members an income that they very much wish. It's not pessimistic, it's a realistic take on where we are.
So that segues perfectly into my next question. So one of the key issues for us in conservation is how we make sure that land is set aside for nature or co-delivering nature. Given that there's over-promising of land in the current policy space at the minute to a significant degree. I can't remember what the figure is, but it's an area equivalent to the size of Northern Ireland, I think, in this country, is over-promised under the current policies, such as farming and renewable energy and biofuels, etc. So how do we make sure in the conservation sector going forwards that we can sort of positively influence land use policies and strategies, and that includes farming and agri-environment, includes forestry, includes renewable energy. But we need to make space for nature recovery, which often, when it gets to the crunch, gets relegated down the list compared to some of those other things. So what can we do in terms of that fighting smarter to make sure that our voice is heard around the conservation side of things in this big debate that's going to be had in the coming months, years around land use in this country? And I go to Roisin first for that one.
Yeah, so I think we need to make sure that when it comes to being smarter, that we're reaching out beyond our own sector. And so thinking about land use, one of the things that struck me about what Derek just said is, if we're going to be able to join up different, not just talking about the reserve model, not just joining up different reserves, but if we're talking about a UK that is more equitable and more nature rich, I personally think that one way of doing that is to encourage new entrants into farming. But in order to get into farming, you have to own land or have enough money and come from that background to be able to obtain it, something I currently don't have. I think if you get new blood into that system, there is a lot of opportunity and potential there for new ways of doing things, but also increased connectivity. So for me, one of the big things that we don't do necessarily in the nature sector enough is reach out to other kind of key areas, such as thinking about how do we do exactly what Derek's just said, break down that land use system and kind of rebuild it, and think about how we can make it more equitable, and think about those kind of intersections that go beyond just nature and carbon, in essence, because carbon is also a big player and a big problem driving up land use prices as well at the moment, which makes things more difficult for little players like myself who would maybe want to do a lot more exciting, innovative stuff.
Great. Yeah, it's a very valid point here in the New Forest, where any bit of land that you could put any kind of livestock on is 20 to 30,000 pounds an acre. So how people getting into farming, buy new land in that kind of situation is really tough. I'm going to come to Derek next. In terms of influencing policy, I haven't mentioned the DEFRA word yet, but that is the department that covers many of the aspects that we've touched upon today. So what's your view about ultimately how do we influence the policy side in DEFRA, because that has the biggest impact on those issues like farming, forestry, and nature recovery. What's your view on how we could do that better? And I'm sure you've got a view on that.
You're asking me how we can. DEFRA is a political pawn. It's a wee weak department that is is greatly under-resourced. It has some very decent people in it, but they basically bark to the tune that the politicians say. So it's until the politicians make their mind up about what they're going to do. And at the moment, if you've noticed, the leaders from every party there is are cozying up once again to the NFU. Ed Davey was on TV the other day here telling us that we should listen to the farmers because they had the solutions, and they were not reformed farmers then. Until they have an instruction. So that goes from DEFRA to its leprechaun Natural England, and from its leprechaun Natural England, it's inflicted on the rest of us. So how do we influence that? You have to influence the politicians, and I don't have the answers to that. What I would say when it comes to the topic that we were discussing initially, and Roisin mentioned people coming into farming, I think that's very important. And I think that it's very important that people who have nothing to do with farming culture come into farming, and they look at cut flowers, and they look at whether they can make it, or whether they can go wild foraging for the watercress that's not polluted in the valley bottoms around them. They come with new money and new enthusiasm. It's how farming's always worked. It was never a protectionist industry. If you look at when I was little in the Scottish borders, you had people, still alive, like Lord Hume of the Hurstle, and you'd go to his farm or my great uncle to look at a boring Galloway cow in a shed, which would then try to kill you. And there you have a clock tower, and you have the stables where the Percherons well, and all that money came from empire. Empire created model farms, and then it broke down. Not a thing was left that was economic, and it passed. And what it passed into were the subsidies, and the subsidies have been a great ill. They start well before we join the European Union, and these are the things that bed in one form of land use and ensure that it can exist while everything else fails. One of your commentators has just put this thing up about the fact that when it comes to paying for programs, they're 3 years, they're 5 years, they're 2 years. Recent award that DEFRA announced of 18 million to save a broad panoply of species from extinction. You had to spend all that if you got the money, and it was so damn complex to apply for that nobody I know, and I know many people, was in any way sure as to how you were going to apply. There had to be an instantly shovel-ready project, which is near impossible to create. You might be able to bodge something together to get some of the cash, but you couldn't employ staff, and you have to spend every single penny of it by 2025. How on earth are we going to improve we go around and say that they've committed this money to nature, but it's a facile charade. If you want to do anything about this, you're going to have to grow a new kind of person. You're going to have to grow a person that is something of farming, something of forestry, something of politics, something of nature conservation, something of the best that the zoos can deliver. And you're going to have to create this new guild of young people that you are going to support fairly. The worst thing about young people is the young people of the future, but they all too often are drawn into bureaucratic organizations where their hopes are wrung out of them within months. And it's wrong. Enthusiastic, bright, flaming young people are the future of this planet. But by Christ, I work with some of them, and they are hard going. And it means that when you're old, you have to look at what they say to you, and you have to listen, and you have to accept very early on that if you wish to have a relationship with them, then it's not all going to be your way. It'll be a compromise. But what you must never do is wring the essence out of them, because if you put out the light that's burning at the beginning, then you put it out forever. So we can see the solutions. That's the frustration of this. It's like being on a runaway train, hurtling through the dark towards the edge of the cliff and just not being able to lean out fast enough to hit the brake levers. It's doable. It doesn't have to have an unhappy ending, but we have a lot of sorting out to do.
Yeah, no, agreed. I'll come to Richard next. So you're closest to the coalface on this one, probably, in terms of influencing policy. And dare I say it, you're probably taking a hit for the conservation team. While many of us are out in the field enjoying wildlife in the flesh, you're, in the corridors of Westminster trying to influence from that side of things. So you're very close to that policy side, and I know that's a really key part of your role. How do you see, as a community, we can influence sort of land use strategy, these really big things that often seem very difficult for an individual to get a grip of? And even we've struggled with it with things like the Curlew Recovery Partnership, these big policy issues. How can we actually make a difference to those to the extent that we can actually see it and therefore make it feel like it's worthwhile carrying on fighting for it?
Yeah, there's nothing that will sort of suck the soul out of an enthusiastic youngster better than the slow grind of policy progress, is there? It does sometimes feel like geological time to make a difference. But every now and then we get a big breakthrough. Moments like the public money for public goods moment, albeit that it's falling backwards now, was an amazing moment. And we can win those. I guess if you ask me to say honestly how I think we do it better, I slightly disagree with Derek. I don't think that we've had the answers. I think we, in the conservation movement, have been brilliant at campaigning to stop bad stuff, but we have often been woeful at saying what the big system changes are that would actually make that difference for nature. And very, very rarely have we gone into the key moments in an electoral cycle, for example, saying, this is what you've got to do, government, if you're serious about halting the decline of nature by 2030. Instead, we go in with a list of 100 things that all are individually lovely, but are they really going to sort of restack the odds of the greedy, acquisitive, exploitative human nature that's led us to this point that where, unfortunately, the profitable choice is to exploit our natural world more? No. So I think if we're actually going to make a difference, we need to organise and mobilise better as a sector around some really big, exciting changes. I guess when it comes to the particular question that you've posed around land use, I think we should be in a world where our planning system has nature restoration at its heart, where we ban more stuff that's bad. So we ought to be banning the most intensive land use practices that have caused overgrazing and despolation of our landscapes. We ought to be paying better for those things that are good. And we ought to have things like 30 by 30 set out in law. So that's the promise to protect 30% of land and sea for nature in law, in a way that doesn't just give them notional protection like we have at the moment for SSSIs, but actually punishes the people who do harm and rewards the people who do better. So we're at a great moment now. We're coming up to a general election. I hope very much that as a sector we will rise to the challenge and speak mightily in favour of some big systemic changes. Let's create allies of the farmers. Let's not have these arguments anymore. Let's say we want to be on your side and make the farmers who do the most for nature richer. You know, it's not just public money for public goods where we pay for the cost of income foregone and the cost of the action. We want to make you richer. And for planning and land use, let's ban the worst stuff, put 30 by 30 in a land use framework, and let's get the state buying more land for nature where it can do that in a positive way. So there are some big ideas here that we need to unite around. Spoiler alert, we hope that at Wildlife and Countryside Link we've got some of those, and if you want to join our campaign, get in touch. But I think organising and mobilising around things that aren't sticking plaster solutions, but are big systemic changes that make the polluter pay, that make nature conservation profitable, and make the environmental choice the easiest choice when the consumer hits the shelves.
Can I come back in, Russ? Because I do think there's an important aspect of this land use thing that we haven't touched on necessarily, that the most impact that I've ever seen in terms of changing people's minds is getting people out to see the actual spaces that we're changing or the wildlife that we're trying to influence. I just don't think there's anything more powerful in terms of actually articulating what that vision is than showing somebody the thing, because when it's written on a framework, oh my God, can I not be bothered to read it? Wow, Nelly, it doesn't work for the way my brain works. But if I go out and see an inspirational landscape, or critically what is not there, I feel so inspired. And I think that that's one of the areas that we can have the most impact. For us, it's about, you know, as much as we possibly can on our limited budget, getting young people out to see what they're actually campaigning for. And I hope that we can do the same with, you know, MPs and policy makers and all the rest of them. That would be my big key driver, I think, which is probably, you know, an age old, something we already know, but I think it's a really important one to flag.
Yeah, I think you know,
I'd also say at the end of this, if you can see the thing on my phone, and I'll try and press it up to the screen. That is, whoops, that is green hair streak. Okay, rare butterfly for here. And I mean, we've been working away on habitats of the farm, stripping out the livestock and reducing numbers for the last 3 years. Things are starting to change. There are reed buntings here. There are meadow pipits. With the first cuckoo that stayed and bred, these butterflies are coming by. But alongside taking people to see the lovely stuff, you have to go and show them what happened, the Vale of the Wye, when you move all those lambs onto turnips right along the riverside, and how that soil flows off those fields and into that river. You've got to go and look at the last of the pearl mussels. You know, virtually the entire population of pearl mussels in South Wales is in a fridge. That's it. And nobody's got a clue as to how you're going to reintroduce these things that once provided the jewels for the kings and queens of Wales back into river systems that are toxic. You've got to go and look at the chicken farms on the Wye, where the laughable standoff band is, I don't know, the fields are still farmed. And you spread the shit from these billions of birds, you know, onto a landscape with a 3-meter exclusion band. It's utterly ridiculous until people are shown the wonders, shown what can be done. The white-tailed eagles soaring above the road for us, they were last weekend. The butterflies, the larks and the pipits regrouping, and then shown the really bad bits. Then it's very difficult for them to balance their views, especially if they know nothing about it. But you try and get those guys to let you in to look at these things. They won't want to do that.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. So we need to know what good looks like, but we also need to know what bad looks like. And and I think one of the other key points earlier was how do we get a new generation of people into farming and other land use practices that have got, you know, fresh ideas, different perspectives. It's a very hard sector to engage in. In terms of conservation models, we've talked a bit about Yeah, Richard's obviously representing Wildlife and Countryside Link, and it's a very large number of conservation NGOs. We've also talked, I mentioned earlier the fact that the dealing with the sewage dumping was largely an organic bottom-up process, excuse the pun. So I'm interested in your perspectives on current conservation models. Yeah, this sort of top-down, so you've either got state-driven or the large NGO type model, or small local groups that somehow start to coalesce into something that might be regional or national. So where do we think we should focus effort? Is the current conservation delivery model effective, or do we need to do something that's a little bit more locally focused, that brings on board the practitioners and the land managers in a more sort of cohesive way? So Roisin, what's your view on that? Is it a locally driven future, or is it one that's still very national and top down?
I personally love to see a locally driven future. I'd love to reach a place where decisions can be made on a community scale, where you're bringing lots of different stakeholders together. I don't necessarily think that we are remotely there yet due to the way land use is. However, I'd love to see it. The one thing I think is an interesting element of that conversation is that often you'll see small groups gain a lot of momentum over a particular issue. And I think often the problem is 2 or 3 years down the line, when they've been kind of going on one specific issue for a very long time, and they're not necessarily getting the same traction, and then you kind of experience burnout, and you end up with these quite powerful, brilliant groups starting off with very, very little resource, but just able to move through sheer passion and momentum. But then you get to a place where, as one of our commenters in the chat mentioned, they're not being funded, they're doing it all off their own back, they're experiencing issues that they're, cost of living, for example, and it burns out. However, sometimes they get replaced with new issues. That can be a powerful thing anyway. But I think there is a huge value in those big nature organizations. I would reflect, I don't necessarily want to be part of them anymore, because I think they move too slowly for me personally, and I find that to be demotivating. I want to see things move in a more radical, high speed way, not so high speed that everything goes wrong and there's no appropriate decision making at the heart of it. But I want to see things move more quickly and with more passion. So for me, those grassroots, as much as they can fall down into a trap of kind of huge momentum and then burning out very quickly, I think they're incredibly powerful, and I think that we should do a bit more. And also those big NGOs should be doing a lot more to support them, because often I think they can be seen as sort of a vocal mad bunch, but actually they're not a vocal mad bunch. They're an incredibly passionate tool, and we should be doing more to resource them. I say we, UK Youth for Nature have not got a very large budget, but we should be doing more to resource them.
So I'm going to come to Richard next. So obviously you're in an interesting space representing a large number of NGOs, some big, some small. How do you see some of these sort of local grassroots operations from your perspective, and how do you take what by necessity, when you're dealing with policy, has to generally be a scaled up sort of national perspective back down to a local level with local people, and it includes farmers, gamekeepers, land managers, conservationists, etc. How do you balance that off in the advocacy that you're doing?
You can rarely win a national change without being able to describe how it would actually work on the ground, and that marriage of bottom-up energy and, I hope, the sort of professional specificity that we can lend in terms of turning passion into policy is a brilliant marriage. I mean, has it worked? Clearly not enough yet. But I would say we need more of it all rather than more of one or the other. We also need to make sure that the conservation movement doesn't end at the conservation movement's borders. We need to be working more and more with the folk who care about health and well-being, and making sure that people, fantastic campaigners like the Kissy Deborah family, who are out there fighting air pollution because of the poor lad lost his life early because of asthma from air pollution. We need to be making allies with the mental health community who want to see better preventative healthcare, which means not just treating the symptoms, but actually getting rid of the root causes of so much distress for people, which is disconnection with nature and finding the solace that nature brings. We need also to be working with the progressive businesses and making sure that we are building alliances with winners in industry who can make a difference and be in there fighting the case for us in Parliament and in government. But most of all, I guess the modal shift that I would like to see as a conservation movement is the one I've sort of tired you with over and over again today, which is we need to be taking ourselves away from fighting on the defensive foot and start fighting for something, for those big changes in the way we stack our economy so that the people who do the good things get paid more, changes in the system so that the most polluting chemicals, the most intensive land use choices are simply illegal, and choices that mean that we take a much rounder view of success, whether it's in avoiding ill health before it comes, or whether it's the way we measure our success as an economy. And it's in those big fights that I think we need to focus attention, so that instead of always trying to cling to the last remnants, we're actually starting to, well, to borrow that sort of UNified phrase, create an economy that works in harmony with nature, rather than trying to defend nature from an economy that works against it.
And Derek, I'm going to pose it slightly different to you. So you've come from a farming background. Obviously, you've got a perspective on the NFU, but from in terms of how we engage with the farming community, what would be your view on how we could do that better going forwards? How do we make that relationship work? You're still on mute at the minute. That's it.
Okay. Money. There you go. Money. There's your simple answer. You pay people well to do what you want them to do. And there will be people within that band who will say, oh, we're not here to do this. We're here to farm. This is all shit. This is counterculture. We need to feed Britain, blah, blah, blah. But for the vast majority who are sensible, if you pay them well and you show them how to do it, they will do it. And what you do is you target the marginal land and the uplands, and you cut all the crap about paying pirates another 10 million to destroy even more of Dartmoor over the next decade, when they've had 23 million and produced an ecological disaster. You do what Natural England has bravely tried to do, and is standing on the ramparts of Troy, looking at the forces of opposition welling up in front of them, and possibly quivering a bit in the organisation. But you cannot allow people who sit down with you and say, we're going to work together, there's the programme we've designed, you give us the loot, we'll spend it. And in 20 years' time, when they spend the loot and produce something that is much, much worse than it ever was to begin with, and let's be quite clear about this, it wasn't good at the beginning, then you give in again. So you're going to have to show, it's going to have to be carrot, and it's going to have to be a rod of iron, so that if you don't do what you're paid to do, then it's censure and you don't get your money. But for the people who do what they are paid to do well, and that was the intention of ELMS when it began, though it's become a very confusing fiasco, and you'll note that as we approach the portals of it all still happening, that there are still no announcements about money and what it's going to mean, then you pay them well and people will do it. Some people will do it, and it will change the culture as well. So I think that's how you affect change.
Yeah. Just for those in the audience, we are into the last 20-25 minutes. So if you do have a question, and it can be specifically on this topic, but given that we've got three really good panelists, if you've got a question for them, please put it in the chat in the next few minutes, and we'll come to those in a minute. I've got one more for you guys, and it's something we've touched on a little bit. So Yeah, conservation by its very nature as a vocation is quite attritional. You know, normally you do a job and you go home at the end of the week and you get patted on the back and you say, oh, that's really good, you've done well there, that's progress, you've made some money, you've made a difference to something or other, the world's a better place. It's quite hard in conservation for many of us to come home at the end of a week and say, I've done really well, I've turned around this species population, or this bit of land looks better than it was, 10 years ago. So it's quite a difficult vocation in that respect, and at the moment a lot of the media headlines are very negative around conservation. So I'm interested in your views, particularly for those in their early careers. What would be your advice? You guys to varying degrees have been in the game for a while. You've come at it from different angles. What would be advice to particularly budding young conservationists about how to cope with that attrition? If you're coming out of a degree or whatever, and you're 20 years old. Yeah, you're potentially going to be in this game for 50 years. That's a very, very long time to be in a very attritional vocation that doesn't pay particularly well at the minute. So I'll start off with Rasheen. What's your advice for people coming into this career as to how they can manage themselves to be able to keep fighting over what for some of them might be a 50-year span?
I've got many thoughts. Firstly, get off Twitter. Use it as minimally as you possibly can. And that goes for most of social media. Make sure that, particularly if you're doing a social media job, I say this with total sincerity. When I was working the Hen Harrier project, I was managing the Sky Dancer Twitter. And the amount of abuse you would see on there made me really, really struggle with my mental health. So get off Twitter, or at least only use it for professional connections. Share your passions, but don't fall for the comment sections. It's hideous. It's just awful deathscape. The other thing is, and it's kind of linked to that, is listen and learn from those who you do not agree with. And I don't mean on social media, I mean in person. Try and make sure you're actually having conversations with people that you disagree with to understand their position, not necessarily to get on board with it, but just so that you understand the argument a lot better, because it makes you a lot stronger as a conservationist, I think, and also as an advocate and campaigner. The other kind of key two things I think are really important is make sure you are balancing yourself and the work that you're doing with the experience of the thing that you're fighting for. So for me, I had a terrible time during furlough, and the big choice for me was going from full-time at the RSPB to going to 3 days a week and becoming a flower farmer 2 days a week. I took a huge pay cut, but it didn't matter because it has paid off dividends for my mental health, and that's really important. And the last point is seek out community. You have to find other people who are passionate, angry, furious, brilliant, or who just know a lot of things that you don't know a lot about, and stick with them and make sure you support them and that they support you. I think those are some of the kind of key things that get me through as a young conservationist, even though I'm heading off from that sort of descriptor now. Yeah, but get off Twitter, seek out community in other forms, and make sure it's in person, because one of the biggest terrible things that happened due to COVID was that we all went online and then many of us didn't come back off. So
yeah, no, some good points there. And yeah, the community one is a really good one. Yeah, there's nothing better than finding Cantharus fusca and a bit of nice semi-natural grassland and then showing someone else and they're equally as enthused by it. That just, that floats my boat. I'll come to Derek next. How do we cope with the attritional nature of conservation in this country? If you've got a 50-year career ahead of you, how do you manage yourself to deal with all this stuff?
Am I muted or not?
No, you're good.
Okay, it's a bloody mute button going. Right, okay. You have to be, if you're going to be a useful person as far as nature is concerned, you have to have a bright flame burning inside you. And if you do not have that flame, then think very carefully about whether it's really what you want to do. Maybe a career in, I don't know, international banking or the ministry. That's what my mother wanted me to do, would be a better choice of life to follow. You have to, but if you decide that that is what you want to do, you have to start off with the courage of convictions. See these old people that tell you you're wrong, you ignore them. They're people who've looked for comfort in their lives. They want to push issues that are difficult back until one day they're in the golf course or playing mahjong with their 86-year-old mother in a care home. They are not the kind of people you should have any respect for at all. History teaches us that laws are made by people who oppose progress. You sometimes have to look at what people tell you can't be done and what can be done and ignore it and do what you think's right. But if you are that kind of person, then this planet needs you very desperately. If you have skills and you're prepared to tough it out and you're prepared, as Rasheen's just said, to find friends, because you will find a very few people in this life who think like you. And if you all live long enough, they will help you every day of the existence that follows. And you will be able to pick up that phone and say, I need a hand with this. And they'll do it. Twitter is a nothing. At the end of the day, there's a thing called a block button on it. Just press it and the wee idiots, the vileness disappears. And it can be very useful if you want to. I mean, I'm just finishing a book about the history of the wolf in Britain, which is fascinating. They did not end in one battle on a mountain pass. We were involved. And of course, as soon as we're involved, it always becomes much, much more complex than that. But when you put an appeal out, you will have an array of very good people who give you the most brilliant kaleidoscope of bits of information and places to go and see. It can be a very useful tool. It can be a very useful campaigning tool. But one of the things that I would say, I mean, I'm nearly 60 now. You had intentions. If you want to do this, don't think you're going to make everybody happy. You are not going to make everybody happy. But what you have to have is the courage of your convictions. And I always like that wee phrase just to end in the Lorax, where he says, I'm here for the trees. At the end of it all, there are very few people, some who are truly remarkable when you look back, like Archie Blaney, who called himself Grey Owl, or people who've just said no. I mean, the survival of the beavers, all of the Scandinavian beavers depended on one old farmer saying, "You are not killing them on my land." The survival of the beautiful antelope, as a blessbok, depended on one or two old Afrikaner Dutch farmers saying, "You are not killing them on my land." There have been remarkable times where remarkable people have stood for what's right. So if you're a young person, you bear that in mind, because that's the kind of person that you must become.
Richard, I'll come to you last. I'd imagine that your job is quite attritional as well at times. So what's your advice for people in the sector in coping with that over a long time span?
It is, and I guess I'm the voice of the sort of boring, grey institutional stuff here, aren't I? And here I am in a tie. Do I like wearing a tie? Not very much, but I do it because it's part of the uniform of policy change. And I guess I'd like to just tell any young folk who are listening that actually it is tremendously fun working in environmental policy as well as attritional. I've been doing it for 2 decades now, and I love it. I love it because I want to win, and I intend to, because it's something that's important. I like being in a movement that I feel is progressive and is hopefully changing the world for the better. And sometimes we actually do succeed. I mean, they're few and far between, but those moments where you actually make a difference are jewels. I wrote a little amendment that changed the Climate Change Act right at the start of my career, and it stayed with me all this time. And with things like with Wildlife and Countryside Link, we won the world's first target in law to halt the decline of wildlife by 2030. And people may scoff at that and say, ha, they'll never do it. But the fact is, it's given us a legal lever that is going to make a difference for the next decade if we use it properly. And those things make me immensely proud. And also, I'm just find huge joy in working with many wonderful people in the sector. I'm probably what I'm about to say is probably terrible for modern mental health thinking. You're supposed to separate work and life. But actually, I have loads of wonderful friends in my workplace because I find so many people are dedicated, wonderful, and there's always somebody who knows that mad bug better than you do. I texted someone from Bug Life at Christmas. On Christmas Day, what was I thinking a couple of years ago to ask what the weird beetle was that had come out of my Christmas tree when I put the fire on, and got a text back straight away to explain that it was some pine beetle or other. It's fantastic. People love it. We're in it to win it, and we're in it to celebrate the joys of nature. So it does get hard some days, but there are plenty of wonderful moments in there as well. And if I didn't think that we weren't in a movement that's actually going to change the world for the better, then I wouldn't be in it. And it's a joy.
Yeah, I was. We haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, but I'm always full of admiration of your eternal optimism. It's fantastic, and I enjoyed Derek's face during your answer almost as much as I enjoyed the answer itself. I'm going to bring Mary's lurking in the background here, and she's just posted something on the chat. But I'm going to invite Mary to turn off her mute button and just come in on this one. It's something that Mary and I talk about quite a lot, but given that we've been on the road to some of our European neighbours, what's your perspective, Mary, on this issue about how do we support those, particularly in their early career, get set up for a potential 50-year career in conservation and to cope with everything that gets thrown at us?
Oh God. Well, that is the big question, isn't it? But you'll fight for something that you love. You'll fight if you really feel it. If it's some abstract concept, then it's very difficult to sustain as Derek says, that in a brightly burning light. It'll get smothered by too many things too quickly. So what we have to do is instill that love and passion wherever it is, and everyone has it. Every single person has that ability to fall in love with something and to really, really champion it. The biggest thing I say is just choose something to love and love it, and just love it to death, your death probably. Just keep going and don't let anything or anybody get in your way. And don't let anybody put you down or patronize you or tell you you're not qualified or blah, 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 sex, gender, God, just do it. Just do it and care about it, and never stop thinking of the big picture. So keep your feet on the ground, keep your head in the stars, and learn. I haven't got a background in natural history at all, not at all. But you learn, and you learn about it, and you push through right to the end because you love it. And it's that connection. So I put that comment in the chat. Unless we connect people back to the natural world in a way that means something, in a way that's relational, in a way that you look outside and you just feel wonder every day, that's what keeps you going. You won't keep going because you've read a book or you've seen a nice television program. That won't work. It'll work if you fundamentally, deeply love something or some things. It doesn't have to be one thing. So that's what I would say. Just go with your passion, wherever you're drawn to. For me, it was the curlew, but it could be anything. It could be your little beetle that lives in a dead tree, Russ, that you keep sending me pictures of all the time. Like every day. What is it?
The green forest hoverfly, Capriolus speciosa.
Can I say one thing at the end of that? Twice in my life, I've been in places where you felt there was a spirit that was almost celestial, that drove you, where you were amongst other people that had lived a life in different places, that had experiences that were so similar that it was deeply moving. The first was in Jersey in 1990. I did not meet Gerald Durrell. I've had some bits to do with the people that he inspired. And we're doing things for Rothschild's myna and this little beautiful white myna bird that speaks, and who did so at peril of their lives, when it came to powerful people, and at peril of their wives' lives and their families' lives and their children's lives. So see, every time you sit in a meeting in Britain and you have an argument about a fucking newt, you look at it and think, what low people we've become. And then the other time is NEP. You go there and you meet the most brilliant people passing through. The spirit is there. We've got to, I don't know how we bottle it. I don't know how we produce it. But look at these things. These are the things that will carry people sometimes to the death. And that's what you need. The dry courses we run. I mean, I was looking at a training course the other day down here, £4,000 a head for 12 weeks, which shows you how to build a bird box and put down a quadrat on the ground to see if it's a daisy or a dandelion you're about to stand on. That is no good. We need something that we need more of what measures up to that kind of inspiration. And people meeting other people from all over the world who cope with these massive problems is also incredibly important, because we're way too insular and way too petty in our thinking on this silly wee bumptious island.
So we've got 10 minutes left. I'm going to pull together 2 or 3 of the questions that have come in the chat, and thank you for contributing them. So one of the key threads that's coming out of these questions is, how do we, we're in a minority, how do we influence the majority? That's probably the easiest way I can put it. So I'll come to you, Roisin, first. So there's a big majority out there that aren't engaged, maybe don't want to engage, and that we're not engaging. How do we start to get this all more mainstream so that we start to influence that majority going forwards to get good conservation outcomes?
Yeah, I think probably the brutal answer to that question is we have to accept that there's a lot of people out there who aren't just going to love nature for nature's sake. However, there are ways that we can get to them. Absolutely. I fundamentally believe that, because I'm a terrible optimist. And I think ways into that are for us to make those connections outside of the sector, like we were talking about before. So whether it's through green prescribing and healthcare and getting people to kind of understand the incredible health benefits that it can have for themselves, or whether it's through art like we do at UK Youth for Nature, and creative campaigning and finding a route into nature that isn't necessarily about nature but is about the skill that they want to develop, and it's like hooking them through other means. And I think there are a huge variety of ways that we can do that, but sometimes we become so bogged down in like the terror or the anger or even the passion for one small thing that we forget to sort of stand back and look at the other connections and the other places we can influence that change. So for us, that's one thing that we will be working on, which is using and developing people's skills and just funneling them quite passionately into nature conservation, but also reaching out across different sectors and finding ways to tap into people's passions and cares, that maybe isn't just nature first, but gets us to the same objective in the end.
Great. Derek, what's your view on the best ways to engage with people that aren't engaged or aren't connected to nature at the minute? How do we solve that one?
I think we need to tell stories. Storytelling has always been one of the things that's endured in us and as species, as soon as our tails dropped off and we sort of figured out how we could master fire. So you have to tell people stories of great possibilities. You have to make them entertaining. I've met some great people with great stories to tell who give the dullest presentations ever. And I think that's a very important part of inspiring people. And I think you also have to have people lead by example very nobly. Mary, bless her, what a remarkable woman. Look at what she's done for curlews. Has she achieved anything that amounts to personal gain on the back of it? As far as I can see, no. You know, has she had some bitter disappointments with government overruling her when it came to her national curriculum syllabus and appointing, I don't know, some YTS kid from a university that nobody's ever heard of to advise on how you put together something complicated when it could have been done with people that had great minds and could have produced something that was internationally beautiful? Yes, she has. And yet she's coped with that disappointment and gone, well, and if she were here now, I'd like to give her a big hug, because she's the kind of person that nature needs. And before I finish, and this is not to pick on Richard again, what I will just say is I've had a belly full of big pictures in my life. One of the lovely things I always tell anybody who tells me about a big picture is that if you have any interest in history at all, you'll perhaps have heard about the Roman defeat in the Teutoburg forest, which virtually broke the empire when the German governor responsible led an army of 22,000 people, 22,000 sole legionnaires into the forest. They were betrayed and massacred during a fight that lasted for 3 days in the rain. It took the empire 3 years to go back in and pick up the bodies of their dead. And those people, that's what happens when you're focused on the big picture and you ignore the nuts and bolts that put the big picture together. I'm terribly sorry, I have no formal education. I'm the kind of person that gets bitten and kicked by things, or I delegate that sort of thing now because I don't like it very much. But you've got to look at these little things, because of the cogs and the sprockets and the grommets So Big Picture is like some sort of Buster Keaton American movie whereby his car hits a wood mouse on the road and the whole fucking thing dissolves. So it's a combination of all approaches. But when one part has no respect and will not assist another part, then it's very difficult to make any big picture work.
Yeah.
Oh, and that wasn't directed at you, by the way, Richard. It's just because you happen to be there wearing your tie, that's all. And hiding your drink underneath it in a surreptitious fashion.
Although you notice he's moved to tea now, so it's getting to that stage of the evening. Well, at least I hope it's tea. Mary, I'd imagine, was nodding, even though she wasn't on camera at the start of that, where you were talking about telling stories, and that's something where Mary and with Curlew Action we're very keen on doing. There you go, big thumbs up. She does get grumpy sometimes, but as we've noted in this discussion here, yeah, having peers that you can lean upon during those grumpy times is absolutely key. If all your peers are grumpy too, then you're in trouble, but we haven't been there yet, have we, Mary? There's normally only one or other of us that's grumpy on any given day.
Really close.
Yeah. So that last question then, Richard, you know, how do we influence the majority in a positive way for conservation, whether that's the political majority, the electorate, business, whatever? How do we influence the majority?
I hope I've never said just do the big picture and not do the little one. If I ever have, then it was in error, and I think making sure that you, one of the fun things about this job is always being able to engage with the whatever conservation organization it is, large or small. We've got some organizations in our club who are basically one person and their pets, and some as big as the National Trust, and they're all important. So I hope I'm not in that big picture at the expense of the little club. Most of what I would have said has been said on this. I guess the one addition that I would add on top of speak to people's other priorities is that we must also change the way we look. I know this is hard, but we are not an inclusive sector, are we? And if we're serious about building a movement that reaches across every element of our society, we've got to move from a situation where we are as the second least diverse sector in the country. Things are starting to change, and there are lots of good intentions. But if we want to move beyond the fake 8 million, which might be more like 1 million, then we need to make sure that we speak to everybody's priorities, we show ourselves to be inclusive, and that people can see themselves as part of this movement and see the point of being part of it.
Great, thank you. I've got one hand up from a participant, Barry O'Dowd. If you have the opportunity to unmute yourself and quickly make a comment or a question, we might be able to squeeze that in. So Barry O'Dowd, are you able to unmute and ask your question? Doesn't sound like it at the minute. If you get the chance to put it in the chat, we can always pick it up afterwards. I guess I want to finish by saying, from my perspective, I've got a lot of admiration for what you guys are doing. It's people like you that inspire me. It's places like NET that inspire me. It's stories like the ones that Mary's so adept at telling that inspire me. And that's what helps keep me going, as well as getting out there in the field and, seeing the things that I'm trying to work hard for. So whether it's trying to engage the youth community and get them energized and get them engaged, that's so important. I think, Richard, I've said it before, you are taking a hit for the team, but your optimism is infectious, and we need you doing that job desperately. So keep doing it, please. And we need Derricks, and if we had 1 million Derricks in this country, what would this country look like? One can only wonder. But we need you. We need all of you working in your different ways. And I think that's one of the key things, is we can all contribute with our own individual attributes, and they're all going to be very different, and we're going to have very different perspectives. But we need all of you to engage and get stuck in, because the more people we have and the more peers we can lean upon as a community, the better. So thank you particularly to you guys both for coming tonight and for what you're doing in your day jobs. It's absolutely tremendous. Mary, do you want to make any final comments before we close?
Oh no, not at all. This is your gig, Russ. But thank you, everybody. It's been fascinating, and for supporting Curlew Action, everybody. Can't tell you how much it means to all of us. So thank you for turning up. And again, I echo Russ. Thank you, everybody, for doing what you're doing. All of us have a part to play.
Yeah, and I'll finish with the usual spiel. Thanks for supporting Curlew Action. But I think there's some interesting times coming ahead for the organisation. It's been very focused on the curlew conservation side up to now. But with the natural history GCSE, we're working hard behind the scenes to look at opportunities to develop a nature education pathway. And if you're interested in that, please keep an eye on our website and social media, because there's going to be opportunities for people to get engaged and support us in that particular strand going forwards as well. That is, by my watch, 8 o'clock exactly. I'm going to finish before I get told off by Ellen. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. Thanks a lot, guys.